The carriage door swung open before the wheels had fully stopped, and Elena Marsh stepped down into a courtyard so silent it felt like a held breath. No one rushed to greet her. No one smiled. A row of servants stood in perfect stillness along the stone steps, their eyes fixed straight ahead, as if she were furniture being delivered rather than a bride arriving at her new home. At the top of the steps stood a tall man in a dark coat, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. Duke Aldrich Vane did not move to help her from the carriage. He did not offer a single word of welcome. He simply watched her climb the steps alone, her traveling case gripped tight in her gloved hand, her spine straight despite the tremble she refused to let show. "You are late," he said, when she finally stood before him. "The roads were poor, Your Grace," Elena answered, keeping her voice even. "I am sorry for the delay." He studied her for a long moment, the way a man might study a ledger he did not trust. "I am told you come with very little. No dowry worth mentioning. A father drowning in debt. I imagine you are grateful for this arrangement." The words landed like a slap, but Elena did not flinch. "I am grateful for many things, Your Grace. Gratitude does not mean I expected kindness." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "Good, then we understand each other. This marriage exists to settle my family's debts and yours, nothing more. I have no wish to pretend otherwise, and I trust you have no illusions about romance." "None at all," she said, though the words cost her more than she let him see. He turned without another glance and walked into the house, leaving her to follow or not, as she chose. Elena stood a moment longer in the cold air, letting the humiliation settle and pass, before she lifted her skirts and climbed the remaining steps. Inside, the house was grand but joyless. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the halls, their painted eyes seeming to track her every step. A housekeeper named Margaret led her to her chambers, offering only the barest instructions on meal times and the location of the chapel, then left her alone with her trunks and the echo of her own footsteps. That evening, dinner was a silent affair. Aldrich sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat 20, though only 2 chairs were occupied. He read correspondence between courses, barely glancing up. Elena ate slowly, watching him without seeming to watch, cataloging the way his jaw tightened whenever a letter displeased him, the way his eyes would drift, for just a moment, to the empty chair beside his own before hardening again. "You may retire whenever you wish," he said finally, not looking up from his papers. "I have business to attend to. Do not expect my company most evenings. I find it easier that way." "As you wish, Your Grace." He glanced at her then, something almost like surprise crossing his features at her lack of protest. Perhaps he had expected tears, or pleading, or the kind of desperate charm women often use to win his favor. Elena offered none of it. She simply rose, curtsied with perfect correctness, and left the room with her head high. Alone in her new chambers, she allowed herself exactly one moment of grief, pressing a hand to her mouth to keep the sound from escaping. Then she straightened her shoulders, unpacked her trunks herself since no maid had been assigned to help her, and began, quietly, to make sense of the strange, cold world she now belonged to. The following morning, Elena rose before the sun, a habit from her father's modest household where servants were few and every hand was needed. She dressed simply and made her way to the kitchens, startling the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Hetty, who nearly dropped a tray of bread at the sight of the new Duchess standing in her domain. "Your Grace, you oughtn't be here," Hetty stammered. "The house has staff for such things." "I only wish to see the kitchens," Elena said, offering a small smile, "and perhaps to understand how meals are managed here. I do not intend to be idle in my own home." Hetty's suspicion did not vanish, but it softened slightly. Word of the encounter spread through the household by mid-morning, whispered between maids polishing silver and footmen dusting portraits. The new Duchess was not what they expected. She did not ring bells for every small need. She did not scold. She noticed things. Aldrich heard the whispers too, second-hand, from his valet, who mentioned it while helping him dress. He said nothing in response, but that afternoon, passing through the east corridor, he paused when he saw Elena kneeling beside a young maid who had dropped a stack of linens, helping her gather them without a word of complaint. "That is not your task," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Elena looked up, unbothered. "It seemed unkind to walk past and do nothing, Your Grace." She finished stacking the linens and handed them to the trembling maid, who fled with a hurried curtsy. Aldrich watched her rise and smooth her skirts. "You need not concern yourself with the comfort of servants. It is not expected of you." "Perhaps not," Elena said, "but I was raised to believe that kindness costs nothing and often returns a great deal." I do not intend to abandon that belief simply because I now live in a larger house. He had no answer for that. He turned and walked away, and if Elena noticed the slight pause in his steps before he rounded the corner, she said nothing of it. Days passed in this manner, a careful distance maintained between them, broken only by small, unplanned moments. Elena began to learn the rhythms of the estate, the names of the staff, the particular creak of the third stair that always startled the younger housemaids. She wrote to her father twice a week, careful never to mention her loneliness, only assuring him that she was well and that the household ran smoothly. The Dowager Duchess arrived on the 5th day, sweeping into the entrance hall with the force of a small storm, her cane striking the marble floor with every step. Constance Vane was a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and buried more disappointments than most people acquired in a lifetime, and she regarded Elena with an expression that could only be called assessment. "So you are the girl," Constance said, circling Elena slowly. "Small dowry, minor family. My grandson tells me you have no illusions about this marriage." "I do not, Your Grace," Elena said, meeting the older woman's gaze without wavering. Constance's eyebrow lifted slightly. Most young brides in her experience either wept or postured. This one did neither. "Well, at least you are honest. That is more than I can say for the last woman who tried to catch his eye." She said this with a pointed look toward the window, as though the mention carried a story Elena was not yet meant to know. "I have no interest in catching anyone's eye, Your Grace," Elena said. "I only wish to be useful, and to cause no trouble." "Useful," Constance repeated, as if testing the word. How refreshingly unfashionable. She turned and walked toward the drawing room, then paused. "Walk with me, girl. I find I am curious about you, and I am rarely curious about anything anymore." Elena followed, careful and composed, though her heart beat faster than she let show. The Dowager Duchess asked question after question, about her upbringing, her education, her opinions on subjects most society women were never asked to have opinions on at all. Elena answered honestly, without flourish, and by the time the conversation ended, something in Constance's sharp eyes had shifted, though she gave no outward sign of approval. That evening, for the first time, Aldrich did not retreat immediately after dinner. He lingered in the drawing room, a book open on his lap that he did not appear to be reading. Elena sat across from him with her needlework, the silence between them different than before, not hostile exactly, but watchful, as though both were waiting to see what the other might do. "My grandmother spoke well of you," he said eventually, not looking up from his book. "She rarely speaks well of anyone." "I only answered her questions honestly," Elena said. "That is rarer than you might think, in this house." He closed the book without having turned a single page. "Most people tell me what they believe I wish to hear. It grows tiresome. I have very little practice in flattery, Your Grace. I fear I would do it poorly even if I tried." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that Elena noticed. "Then do not try. I find I prefer honesty, however unpleasant it may sometimes be." It was the longest conversation they had shared since her arrival, and though it ended there, with him rising and bidding her a curt good night, Elena found herself replaying it long after she had retired to her chambers. She did not mistake it for warmth, but it was, perhaps, the smallest crack in a wall she had assumed was solid stone all the way through. Outside her window, the estate stretched dark and vast under a sky heavy with clouds, and somewhere within its many silent rooms, a man who had sworn never to feel anything for the wife forced upon him, sat alone with a book he could not read, wondering why her steady calm unsettled him more than any tears would have. Elena did not sleep easily that night. She lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the gardens, the soft groan of old wood settling in the cold. She thought of her father, alone now in their small house, free of the debts that had nearly ruined him, and she reminded herself why she had agreed to this marriage in the first place. It was not for herself. It had never been for herself. Before dawn, she rose again, drawn by habit more than duty, and found her way to the small chapel at the edge of the east wing. It was cold and mostly bare, the pews dusty from disuse, but a single stained glass window let in the first gray light of morning. She sat there quietly, gathering her thoughts, preparing herself for whatever the day would bring. She did not hear him enter until his voice broke the stillness. "You are an early riser," Aldrich said from the doorway, his tone unreadable. "I did not expect to find anyone here. This chapel has not been used since my mother's passing." Elena rose quickly, unsure if she had trespassed somewhere forbidden. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I did not know. I only wished for a quiet place to think." He stepped further inside, his eyes moving over the dusty pews with an expression she could not quite place, something between grief and old anger. "You need not apologize. It is a strange thing to see it used again." He did not explain further, and Elena did not ask, sensing that some doors were not meant to be opened so soon. "I will leave you to your mourning," he said finally, turning to go, then paused at the threshold. "Elena." It was the first time he had used her given name. "Thank you for not asking questions you have every right to ask." He left before she could respond, and she stood alone in the quiet chapel, turning his words over in her mind long after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the corridor. A letter arrived 3 weeks into Elena's new life, addressed to the Duke in handwriting so elegant it seemed designed to be noticed. Elena saw it sitting on the hall table as she passed, the wax seal already broken, and thought nothing of it until she noticed the way the footman avoided her eyes as he carried it toward Aldrich's study. That evening, Aldrich emerged from his study later than usual, his expression tighter than Elena had yet seen it. He said little during dinner, and when Margaret the housekeeper mentioned, in passing, that a guest would be arriving the following week, Elena caught the brief tension that passed between husband and wife, before either could hide it. "A guest, Your Grace?" Elena asked carefully. "Miss Charlotte Reeve," Aldrich said, his tone deliberately flat. "An old family friend. She will be staying for a fortnight while her own household undergoes repairs. I trust you will make her welcome." "Of course," Elena said, though something in his phrasing, the careful distance of old family friend, told her there was more to the story than he intended to share. She did not press him. Instead, she spent the following days preparing the household for a guest, ensuring rooms were properly aired, that the kitchens knew to expect an additional presence at the table, that nothing would be found wanting. She told herself this was simply her duty as mistress of the house, though a small, unwelcome unease had settled in her chest and refused to leave. Charlotte Reeve arrived in a carriage far grander than the occasion required, sweeping into the entrance hall in a gown of deep blue silk, her laughter bright and practiced, as she embraced Aldrich with a familiarity that made the staff exchange glances. "Aldrich, you look positively grim," Aunt Charlotte said, stepping back to study him. "Marriage has not softened you at all, I see." "Charlotte," Aldrich said, his voice carefully controlled, "allow me to introduce my wife. Elena, this is Miss Charlotte Reeve." Charlotte turned, her smile widening in a way that did not reach her eyes. "The new Duchess. How lovely. I have heard so much about you." Her gaze swept over Elena's simple traveling dress, lingering just long enough to make the comparison to her own finery unmistakable. "You must forgive me if I seem overly familiar. Aldrich and I have known each other since we were children. Practically family, really." "Not quite family," Aldrich corrected, a note of warning in his voice that Charlotte either did not notice or chose to ignore. Of course," Charlotte said, waving a gloved hand. "I only mean to say we have no secrets between us. Isn't that right, Aldrich?" Elena said nothing, offering only a polite smile as she led Charlotte toward her prepared chambers, listening to the woman chatter about London society, about mutual friends Elena had never met, about a summer years ago that clearly held meaning only the two of them shared. By the time she left Charlotte settled in her room, Elena's composure felt thinner than she liked to admit. Over the following days, Charlotte made herself a constant presence, appearing at breakfast before Elena had even risen, walking the gardens with Aldrich under the guise of reminiscing about old times, drawing him into conversations that excluded Elena entirely, without ever seeming rude enough to be called out for it. Elena watched it happen with a quiet, aching patience, refusing to let her hurt show, refusing to compete for attention she had never been promised in the first place. "You are very calm about all this," Margaret observed one afternoon, finding Elena in the linen room, folding sheets with more focus than the task required. "Miss Reeve has a way of making herself the center of every room. It would try anyone's patience." "There is little use in being anything but calm," Elena said. "I was not brought into this marriage on the promise of his affection. I have no claim to be jealous of anyone." Margaret studied her for a long moment, perhaps not by promise. "But I have been in this house a long time, Your Grace, and I have never seen the Duke look at anyone the way he sometimes looks at you when he thinks no one notices." Elena said nothing, though she carried the words with her for the rest of the day, unsure whether to believe them or dismiss them as the kind wishes of a sympathetic servant. The truth came, unexpectedly, on a rain-soaked afternoon, when Elena, sheltering beneath the covered walkway near the stables, overheard voices carried on the wind from the garden beyond. Charlotte's voice, low and urgent, and Aldrich's, tight with restrained frustration. You could have chosen anyone, Charlotte was saying. Anyone at all. And yet you married a girl with no name, no fortune, nothing to offer this family. I do not understand it, Aldrich. We were meant for each other. Everyone said so. That was a long time ago, Charlotte, Aldrich replied, his voice weary. Things were different then. My father made this arrangement to save the estate. It was never a matter of choice. Then end it, Charlotte said, closer now, her voice softening into something almost pleading. There must be a way. You do not love her. Anyone can see that. Choose me instead, as you should have years ago. There was a long silence, long enough that Elena's heart pounded painfully against her ribs, waiting, dreading. When Aldrich finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I made a vow, Charlotte. Whatever this marriage began as, I will not dishonor it, or her, by entertaining what you are suggesting. I think it best you understand that clearly. Elena did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly back toward the house, her thoughts a storm she could not quiet, torn between relief at his refusal and a strange, unexpected ache at how little conviction had lived in his voice when he spoke of duty, and how much more had lived in Charlotte's when she spoke of love. That night, Elena could not settle to sleep. She sat by her window, watching the rain streak the glass, when a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Aldrich standing in the corridor, still dressed, his expression unusually uncertain. May I come in? He asked, only for a moment. She stepped aside, and he entered, glancing around her chambers as though seeing them for the first time, though he had never once visited before. I wish to speak with you about Charlotte, he said. I do not know what you may have heard, or what the staff may have whispered, but I would rather you hear the truth from me directly. You owe me no explanation, Your Grace, Elena said quietly. Perhaps not by the terms of our arrangement, he said. But I find I wish to give one regardless. He walked to the window, his back to her, hands clasped tightly behind him. Charlotte and I were close, once. My father favored the match, before circumstances forced his hand elsewhere. I will not pretend there was nothing between us. But whatever it was, it belongs to the past, and I have no wish to revive it. You do not need to justify yourself to me, Elena said, though something in her chest had eased slightly at his words. He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. I know I have given you little reason to trust my word since your arrival. I have been cold and distant, and I offer no excuse for it beyond old wounds I have not learned to set down. But I would ask you to trust this much at least. I did not marry you to insult you, and I do not intend to dishonor you now. Elena held his gaze, searching for the practiced charm she had heard in Charlotte's voice, and finding instead something rawer, more hesitant, a man unaccustomed to offering anything of himself at all. Thank you for telling me, she said simply. He nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence between them. Then he excused himself and left as quietly as he had come, leaving Elena standing alone in her chambers, her heart unsettled in ways she did not fully understand. Charlotte remained for the rest of her planned fortnight, her charm growing sharper as her schemes failed to move him, her glances toward Elena growing colder as the days passed. On the morning of her departure, she paused before Elena in the entrance hall, her smile brittle. You are quieter than I expected, Charlotte said. I thought you might fight harder for him. I have no wish to fight for anything that is not freely given, Elena replied evenly. I hope your journey home is safe, Miss Reeve. Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, some calculation shifting behind them, before she turned and swept into her waiting carriage without another word. Elena watched the carriage disappear down the long drive, unaware that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than a rival for her husband's affection, one who did not accept defeat easily, and who would not forget the quiet dismissal so easily either. With Charlotte gone, the house seemed to exhale, though Elena could not have explained the feeling to anyone who asked. The rhythm of the days settled back into something steadier, and she found herself, almost without noticing, growing more at ease within the walls that had once felt so foreign. She began spending her mornings in the estate's neglected library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books no one seemed to read anymore. Dust lay thick on the shelves, and several volumes had been damaged by damp near the far wall. Elena took it upon herself to catalog what remained, working quietly through the collection with the same patient thoroughness she brought to every task. Aldrich found her there one afternoon, kneeling on the floor surrounded by stacks of old volumes, a smudge of dust across her cheek. He stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed him. I did not know anyone still used this room, he said. It seemed a shame to let so many books sit forgotten, Elena replied, rising and brushing off her skirts. Some of these are quite old. I found a volume of your grandfather's letters tucked behind the poetry shelf. I did not read them, of course. I only thought you might wish to have them somewhere safer. He crossed the room and took the worn leather volume she offered, turning it over in his hands with an expression she could not quite read. My grandfather died before I was born. I have almost nothing of his, beyond portraits and old stories my grandmother tells when she is in a rare mood for sentiment. Then I am glad I found it, Elena said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. You have a gift for finding things others have overlooked. This library, the chapel, perhaps even this house itself. He did not finish the thought, but he did not need to. Elena understood well enough what he meant, and the warmth that rose in her chest surprised her with its intensity. From that day forward, a quiet routine began to form between them, unspoken but steady. Aldrich would often find reasons to pass through the library in the late afternoons, lingering longer each time, occasionally offering an observation about a book or asking after her progress with the cataloging. Elena, in turn, found herself watching for the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, though she would not have admitted it aloud to anyone. The Dowager Duchess noticed the change before either of them fully acknowledged it themselves. She cornered Elena one evening in the drawing room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. You are good for him, Constance said bluntly, setting down her needlework. I have watched that boy carry his grief like armor since his mother died. I did not think anyone would manage to soften it, least of all a girl he married out of obligation. I have done nothing but exist in his house, Your Grace, Elena said, though her cheeks warmed at the observation. Nonsense, Constance said. You have done more than you realize. Patience is its own kind of courage, girl. Do not mistake it for weakness, and do not let anyone else mistake it either. Her gaze grew distant for a moment, as though remembering something from long ago. Charlotte Reeve mistook it for weakness. She will not make that error twice, I imagine, which means you would do well to remain watchful even now that she is gone. Elena took the warning seriously, though she could not have guessed how soon it would prove necessary, nor how far Charlotte was willing to go to reclaim what she believed had once been rightfully hers. The illness came without warning, sweeping through the village nearest the estate in early winter, a fever that left grown men bedridden and took the very young and very old with cruel efficiency. Elena heard of it first from Hetty, whose sister lived in the village and had written in a shaking hand, describing the growing number of sick households and the shortage of anyone willing to nurse them, for fear of catching the illness themselves. Elena did not hesitate. She gathered what medicines and linens the estate could spare and announced her intention to travel to the village that very afternoon. Absolutely not, Aldrich said, when word reached him. He found her in the entrance hall, already dressed for travel, a basket of supplies at her feet. You cannot go near a fever like this. It is far too dangerous. Someone must, Elena said, meeting his gaze without backing down. The village has no one else willing to help. I have some knowledge of nursing, from caring for my mother before she passed. I will not sit idle in comfort while people suffer a short ride from this house. I forbid it, Aldrich said, his voice hard with something that was not quite anger, something closer to fear he did not know how to name. You may forbid it, Elena said quietly, but I will go regardless. I would rather face your displeasure than my own conscience. They stood locked in a silent standoff, neither willing to yield, until Aldrich finally exhaled, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Then I will come with you. If you insist on risking yourself, I will not let you do it alone. Elena had not expected that, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him calling for his own coat, giving orders for additional supplies to be loaded, moving with a purpose she had not seen in him before. Together they rode to the village, and what they found there tested every reserve of strength either of them possessed. The village had become a place of quiet desperation, sick rooms crowded with pale, fevered bodies, the air thick with the smell of illness and the low sound of suffering. Elena moved through it with steady hands, showing Aldrich how to cool a fevered brow, how to mix the tonics that might ease the worst of the symptoms, how to speak gently to frightened children who did not understand why their parents lay so still. Aldrich, to his own quiet surprise, did not shrink from the work. He carried water, held trembling hands, sat through long nights beside strangers' bedsides with an endurance that spoke to something deeper than duty. Elena watched him with a growing, unspoken admiration, seeing in him a man entirely different from the cold figure who had greeted her on the estate steps months before. On the third night, exhaustion finally caught them both. They sat together outside a small cottage, the fever inside finally breaking toward recovery, sharing a rare moment of stillness beneath a clear winter sky. I did not expect this of you, Elena admitted quietly. When I first arrived, I believed you incapable of this kind of care. I did not expect it of myself, Aldrich said, staring up at the stars. After my mother died, I convinced myself that caring for anyone only invited more grief. It was easier to feel nothing at all. He glanced at her, his expression unguarded in a way she had rarely seen. You have made that far more difficult than I anticipated. Is that a complaint, Your Grace? Elena asked, a small smile touching her lips despite her exhaustion. No, he said, and the honesty in his voice startled them both. It is not a complaint at all. They returned to the sick room before either could say more, but something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange, a fragile understanding neither was yet ready to name. The following days brought slow but steady improvement across the village, and by the time Elena and Aldrich finally returned to the estate, exhausted but relieved, word of their efforts had spread far beyond the village itself. Tenants who had once regarded the cold young duke with wary distance now spoke of him with something closer to respect. Elena, too, found herself the subject of quiet admiration among the household staff, no longer merely tolerated but genuinely welcomed. The Dowager Duchess greeted their return with uncharacteristic warmth, embracing Elena briefly before releasing her with a stern look that did not entirely hide her relief. You gave this household quite a fright, disappearing into a fever village with no warning. But I confess I am not surprised you managed it without harm. You are sturdier than you look, girl. I had good help, Your Grace, Elena said, glancing toward Aldrich, who stood nearby overseeing the unloading of their supplies. Constance followed her gaze, a knowing look crossing her sharp features. Yes, I noticed that as well. That evening, for the first time since Elena's arrival, Aldrich requested her company after dinner, not out of obligation, but simple preference, inviting her to walk the gardens despite the winter chill. They spoke of small things at first, the recovering village, the estate's upcoming affairs, before the conversation drifted, as it often did now, toward more personal ground. My mother used to walk these gardens every evening, Aldrich said, his voice quieter than usual. Before she grew too ill to manage the stairs, I have not walked them myself in years. It felt wrong, somehow, to enjoy something she no longer could. What was she like? Elena asked gently. He was quiet for a long moment, and Elena wondered if she had overstepped, until he finally spoke. Kind, far kinder than my father deserved. She used to say that a house without warmth was no better than a well-furnished tomb. I did not understand what she meant until after she was gone, when I watched this place grow colder with every passing year. He glanced at Elena, something vulnerable in his expression. I think perhaps you have begun to prove her right. This house has not felt like a tomb since your arrival. Elena did not trust herself to speak, her throat tight with emotion she had not expected to feel. Instead, she simply reached out and took his hand, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than any words could have offered. He did not pull away. For a long moment they stood together in the darkened garden, the cold forgotten, something new and fragile taking root between them. It was Peter Halden, Aldrich's oldest friend, who first noticed the change when he arrived for a brief visit the following week. He found Aldrich in a far better humor than he had seen in years, laughing genuinely at something Elena had said over breakfast, a sound Peter admitted he had nearly forgotten. Marriage suits you better than I expected, Peter said later, when the two men sat alone with their brandy. I confess I worried, when your father arranged this match, that you would spend the rest of your days as cold as you were the day your mother died. I am glad to be wrong. I did not expect it either, Aldrich admitted. I married her out of necessity, Peter. I never imagined I would come to feel anything beyond obligation, yet here I am, finding myself looking forward to her company, more than I look forward to anything else in this house. Does she know how you feel? Peter asked. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, staring into his glass. I do not know how to tell her, without risking everything we have carefully built. What if she does not feel the same? What if speaking of it only reminds her that this marriage began as nothing more than a transaction? You will never know unless you find the courage to ask, Peter said, and from what I have witnessed in these past days, I would wager the answer is not what you fear. Aldrich said nothing, but Peter's words lingered with him long after their conversation ended, following him through the quiet halls of the estate, into the days that followed, waiting for a moment of courage he was not yet certain he possessed. Meanwhile, Elena had troubles of her own to consider. A letter had arrived from her father, his handwriting shakier than she remembered, describing a persistent cough that had settled into his chest and refused to leave. He assured her it was nothing serious, merely the changing season, but something in the careful, measured tone of his words told Elena he was minimizing his condition to spare her worry. She debated whether to mention it to Aldrich at all. uncertain how to ask for anything beyond what their arrangement already required of him. But when he found her staring at the letter over breakfast, her expression troubled. He set down his own correspondence and asked directly what concerned her. "It is my father," Elena admitted, passing him the letter. "He writes as though it is nothing, but I know him well enough to recognize when he is hiding worry beneath careful words. I would like to visit him, if it would not be too great an inconvenience." "It is no inconvenience at all," Aldrich said, without hesitation. "I will have the carriage prepared. We can leave within the hour, if you wish it." "We?" Elena asked, surprised. "You did not think I would send you alone, did you?" Aldrich said, something almost teasing in his tone. "Your father is now my family as well. However unconventional the arrangement that made it so, I would like to see him myself, and to judge his condition with my own eyes, rather than rely on second-hand worry." The journey to Baron Marsh's modest estate took the better part of a day, and Elena found herself grateful for Aldrich's steady presence beside her, his quiet reassurances easing the anxious churn of her thoughts. When they arrived, Baron Edmund Marsh greeted them from his sickbed with more strength than his letter had suggested, though the persistent cough that interrupted his words told its own story. "You did not need to trouble yourselves," Edmund said, waving off Elena's concern even as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "I am an old man with an old man's cough. It is nothing worth a journey across the county." "Let us be the judge of that, father," Elena said firmly, and something in her tone, steady and unyielding, made the old baron smile despite himself. "Marriage has given you a spine of iron, my girl," he said fondly. "I confess I worried, sending you off to a man I barely knew, into a house I had never seen. But I see now my worry was misplaced." He glanced toward Aldrich, who stood quietly near the door, allowing father and daughter their moment. "You have been good to her, your grace. I see it in the way she carries herself. Thank you for that. She has been far better to my household than I deserved," Aldrich said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "I only hope to be worthy of the trust you placed in this arrangement, Baron Marsh." They remained for 3 days, during which Elena nursed her father back toward steadier health with the same patient care she had shown the fever-stricken villagers weeks before. Aldrich occupied himself by quietly arranging for a proper physician to attend the Baron regularly, and for repairs to the aging estate that Edmund's pride would never have allowed him to request outright. Elena discovered the arrangements only after the fact, moved nearly to tears by the quiet generosity of a man who had once claimed to want nothing beyond a transaction between their families. "You did not need to do this," she said, finding him in the modest stable yard, overseeing the delivery of supplies he had ordered without her knowledge. "I wanted to," Aldrich said simply. "He is my family now, as I said, and I find I am no longer content to see the people I care for suffer, when I have the means to prevent it." The words settled over Elena with quiet weight. "The people I care for." She said nothing, but the warmth that filled her chest at those words lingered long after they had returned to the carriage, long after the modest estate had faded from view behind them, replaced by the familiar road home. Their journey back to Rothmere was quieter than the journey out. Both of them settled into a comfortable silence that no longer needed filling with careful, distant conversation. Somewhere along that road, without either of them fully acknowledging the moment it happened, Elena rested her head against his shoulder, and Aldrich, after only the briefest hesitation, allowed his hand to find hers, their fingers lacing together, as the countryside rolled past beyond the carriage window. Neither spoke of what the gesture meant. Neither needed to. It was enough, for now, to simply exist together in that quiet understanding. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by necessity, slowly becoming something neither had expected nor dared to hope for. But far away, in the drawing rooms of London society, Charlotte Reeve had not forgotten the quiet dismissal she received on the steps of Rothmere Estate, and news of the Duke's growing devotion to his wife, carried swiftly by the ever-hungry gossip of the season, had reached her ears with the bitter taste of confirmation that everything she believed rightfully hers was slipping further from her grasp with each passing day. Charlotte arrived unannounced at a London townhouse belonging to Lord Halden's cousin, where she knew Aldrich's business affairs sometimes brought him during the spring season. She had spent weeks composing herself, layer upon layer of hurt hardening into something colder and more calculating, until she arrived at a plan she believed could not fail. "You look troubled," said her friend, Lady Vivian Ashford, as they sat together over tea. "Still thinking of the Duke, I imagine." "He was meant to be mine," Charlotte said, her voice tight. "Everyone agreed it, years ago, and now he parades that nobody through London drawing rooms as though she were born to the position." She set down her cup with more force than necessary. I will not simply accept it, Vivian. There must be a way to remind him where his loyalty was always meant to lie. What do you intend to do? Vivian asked, uneasy. Charlotte's eyes glittered with something sharp and dangerous. I intend to make certain the Tun remembers exactly what kind of woman he married. A baron's daughter with a drowning estate and no name worth mentioning. It will not take much, I think, to make people wonder if the marriage was ever anything more than desperation on both sides. It began quietly, as such things always did. A comment here, a knowing smile there, whispered among the women who gathered at every ball and dinner party of the season. Charlotte was careful never to say anything outright cruel, only to plant seeds of doubt, wrapped in false sympathy. Poor thing, married so quickly, with so little preparation for society, she would murmur, wondering aloud what truly compelled the Duke to such a hasty arrangement. The rumors reached Elena slowly, the way poison spreads through water, undetectable until the damage was already done. She first noticed it at a dinner hosted by Lady Ashford herself, where conversation seemed to still slightly whenever she approached, where smiles felt just a fraction too polite, too careful. You are imagining things, Aldrich assured her, when she mentioned her unease during the carriage ride home. London society thrives on gossip. It means nothing. But the whispers grew louder over the following weeks, taking increasingly specific shape. A story began circulating that Elena's father had fabricated his debts entirely, engineering the marriage through deception rather than genuine hardship. Another claimed that Elena herself had schemed her way into the match, manipulating a grieving, vulnerable Duke in his weakest moment after his mother's death. Neither story held any truth, but truth, Elena was quickly learning, mattered little once gossip took hold in London's hungry drawing rooms. The worst blow came at the Ashford Ball, an event of considerable importance that most of London society attended without fail. Elena arrived on Aldrich's arm, feeling more confident than she had in weeks, wearing a gown the Dowager Duchess had insisted on commissioning specifically for the occasion. For a while, the evening passed pleasantly enough, filled with dancing and polite conversation. Then Charlotte approached, flanked by two of her closest confidants, her smile sweet as poisoned honey. Duchess Vane, Charlotte said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. How wonderful to see you looking so well, given everything. I do hope the rumors about your father's finances have not troubled you too greatly. Such an unfortunate business, deceiving a duke into marriage under false pretenses, though I suppose desperate circumstances call for desperate measures. The words landed like a struck match in dry grass, conversation around them stilling as heads turned to listen. Elena felt heat rush to her face, humiliation and fury warring within her, but she forced herself to remain composed, refusing to give Charlotte the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I am not certain where you heard such a story, Miss Reeve, Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest, but I would advise caution before repeating claims you cannot substantiate. My father's circumstances were unfortunate, but they were never dishonest, and I will not stand quietly while you suggest otherwise. Oh, I meant no offense, Charlotte said, feigning innocence with practiced skill. I only repeat what others have already been discussing. Surely you cannot blame me for society's natural curiosity about such a hasty, unusual match. Aldrich stepped forward then, his expression harder than Elena had seen it since the earliest days of their marriage. That is quite enough, Charlotte. I would remind you that spreading falsehoods about my wife is spreading falsehoods about my family, and I will not tolerate it regardless of our history. Charlotte's composure flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it. I only wish to express concern, Aldrich. There is no need for such hostility. There is every need, Aldrich said, his voice carrying now, loud enough that the surrounding guests could not pretend not to hear. My wife's father did not deceive anyone. The circumstances of our marriage are our own affair, and I would ask that you, and anyone else inclined to gossip, direct your curiosity elsewhere. Elena has done nothing but bring grace and strength to this family since the day she arrived, and I will not stand by while she is slandered in my presence. The ballroom had gone entirely quiet now, every eye fixed on the small drama unfolding at its center. Charlotte, realizing the tide had turned decisively against her, offered a stiff, humiliated curtsy and withdrew, her confidants trailing uncertainly behind her, their earlier enthusiasm for the gossip suddenly much diminished under the weight of the Duke's public defense. Elena stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden shift, before Aldrich turned to her, his expression softening into something gentler, something that spoke far beyond the requirements of duty or obligation. Are you well? He asked quietly, taking her hand. I am now, Elena said, and meant it. They did not stay much longer at the ball. Aldrich excusing them both with practiced ease, escorting Elena to their waiting carriage with a protective steadiness that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly where his loyalties now lay. But as the carriage pulled away from the Ashford townhouse, Elena caught a final glimpse of Charlotte watching from an upper window, her expression no longer merely wounded, but calculating, already turning her mind toward whatever desperate measure she might attempt next. The Dowager Duchess, informed of the evening's events the following morning, listened with tight-lipped fury before setting down her tea with a decisive clink. "That girl has always been trouble," Constance said. "I warned her mother years ago that ambition without honor makes for a dangerous combination. It seems little has changed." She turned her sharp gaze to Elena, softening slightly. "You handled yourself with more grace than she deserved, child. I am proud to call you my granddaughter, whatever the circumstances that brought you to this family." Elena, still shaken from the previous evening, found unexpected comfort in the older woman's words. "Thank you, Your Grace. I only hope this is the end of it." But Constance's expression remained troubled. "Charlotte Reeve does not accept defeat gracefully. I would not assume this matter closed simply because last night did not go her way. Girls like her only grow more dangerous when publicly humiliated. You would do well to remain watchful, both of you." Her warning proved prophetic sooner than any of them anticipated. For Charlotte, humiliated but far from finished, had already begun composing a far more damaging plan, one that would strike not at rumor and gossip, but at the very foundation of trust between husband and wife that had taken so many careful months to build. In the days following the ball, however, Elena and Aldrich found their bond only strengthened by the public trial they had weathered together. He began seeking her opinion on estate matters he once would have handled entirely alone, valuing her practical judgment on decisions ranging from tenant disputes to household budgets. She, in turn, found herself confiding in him more freely, sharing memories of her childhood, her fears, her small hopes for the future, things she had once guarded carefully even from herself. One evening, as they sat together in the library that had become their shared refuge, Aldrich set aside the papers he had been reviewing and studied Elena for a long moment before speaking. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how differently I imagined this marriage would unfold. When my father first proposed the arrangement, I expected a cold transaction, two strangers sharing a house and a title, nothing more. I did not expect this." He gestured vaguely between them, searching for words that seemed to elude him. "I did not expect to find myself looking forward to your company more than any other part of my day. I did not expect to care so deeply what you thought of me, or to feel such peace simply sitting in a room with you." Elena's heart quickened at his words, hardly daring to hope she understood him correctly. "What are you saying, Aldrich?" He rose and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her chair so their eyes met on level ground, a gesture so unlike the proud, distant Duke who had greeted her on the estate steps months before, that Elena felt tears gather unbidden. "I am saying that I love you," he said simply, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that left no room for doubt, "not out of obligation, not out of duty to this family or this title, but because you have shown me, every single day since your arrival, what genuine strength and grace look like. I was wrong to believe I could never feel this way again after my mother's death. You have proven me wrong in the best possible manner. I love you too," Elena whispered, the words spilling free before she could second-guess them, months of carefully guarded feeling finally given voice. "I have loved you for longer than I dared admit, even to myself." He rose and drew her into an embrace, and for the first time since her arrival at Rothmere, Elena felt entirely, completely at home, not merely as a duty fulfilled or an arrangement honored, but as a woman genuinely, deeply loved by the man she had come to love in return. They spoke long into the night of their future together, of the family they might build, of the estate they would continue to strengthen side by side. It felt, for those precious hours, as though the difficult beginning of their marriage had finally given way to something solid and lasting, a foundation strong enough to weather whatever challenges still lay ahead. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment of joy, how soon that foundation would be tested, nor how close Charlotte Reeve had already come to executing a plan designed specifically to shatter everything they had so carefully built between them. The forged letter arrived at Rothmere on a gray morning, delivered by a messenger no one recognized, addressed directly to Aldrich in handwriting that closely, deliberately mimicked Elena's own careful script. Charlotte had spent considerable effort perfecting the forgery, studying samples of Elena's correspondence acquired through a bribed servant, until she achieved a passable imitation convincing enough to withstand a hurried, emotional reading. Aldrich opened it alone in his study, expecting routine correspondence, and felt the world tilt beneath him as he read words that could not possibly be true, yet were crafted with such careful, cruel precision that doubt crept in despite himself. The letter, supposedly written by Elena to a fictional confidant, described their marriage in the coldest possible terms, claiming she had only ever tolerated him for the security his title provided, that she found his affection tiresome and his company a burden she endured for practical necessity alone, that she had begun, in fact, to consider whether her heart truly belonged elsewhere, to a gentleman she declined to name but described in terms that painted Aldrich as nothing more than a means to an end. Aldrich read it 3 times, his hands trembling with a mixture of fury and heartbreak he had not felt since his mother's death. Every instinct told him something was wrong, that the words did not match the woman he had come to know, whose every action since her arrival had spoken of quiet, genuine devotion rather than calculated tolerance. But grief and old wounds have a way of amplifying doubt beyond reason, and the memory of his father's own betrayals, of promises broken and trust exploited, rose unbidden to cloud his judgment. He confronted her that evening, the letter clutched in his hand, his expression a mask of controlled devastation that Elena had never seen before. "What is this?" he demanded, thrusting the pages toward her before she had even fully entered the room. Elena took the letter with confusion, and as she read, her confusion turned swiftly to horror. "Aldrich, I did not write this. I have never written anything of the kind. I do not even know the person this letter claims to be addressed to. The handwriting is yours," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I have seen enough of your correspondence to recognize it." "It is a forgery," Elena said desperately, searching his face for any sign that he believed her. "Someone has copied my hand, but I swear to you, on everything I hold dear, I did not write these words. You must believe me." "Must I?" Aldrich's voice cracked slightly, the wound clearly deeper than his controlled exterior suggested. "You must forgive me if the timing seems suspicious, Elena. We spoke of love only days ago, and now this arrives, painting an entirely different picture of your true feelings. How am I meant to know which version of you is real?" "The version standing before you now," Elena said, tears gathering despite her efforts to remain composed. "Everything I have told you, every moment we have shared, has been true. I do not know who wrote this letter or why, but I know my own heart, Aldrich, and it belongs entirely to you." He studied her for a long, agonizing moment, torn between the evidence in his hand and the truth he had come to know in her eyes over the past months. But old wounds run deep, and the fear of being deceived again, as his father had once been deceived, proved difficult to silence entirely. "I need time," he said finally, his voice heavy. "I cannot simply dismiss this without understanding where it came from. Until I do, I think it best we maintain some distance." The words struck Elena harder than any cruelty Charlotte had spoken at the ball. She watched him leave the room, her heart breaking in ways she had not thought possible, the fragile trust they had built together suddenly, devastatingly fractured by a stranger's careful malice. That night, alone in her chambers, Elena allowed herself to grieve fully, the tears she had held back for so many months, finally spilling freely. But grief soon gave way to determination. She would not simply accept this injustice without a fight. If someone had gone to such lengths to destroy what she and Aldrich had built, she intended to discover who and why, and to prove her innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. She began by examining the letter itself, studying the handwriting with careful attention, until she noticed small inconsistencies, subtle differences in how certain letters were formed compared to her own natural hand. She brought her observations to Margaret the following morning, who confirmed what Elena had begun to suspect. "This paper," Margaret said, holding the letter up to the light. "It bears a watermark I recognize. It is not the stock kept in this household. I have seen this particular mark before on correspondence delivered to Miss Reeve during her stay here." The revelation sent Elena's heart racing with a mixture of vindication and renewed fury. She sought out the Dowager Duchess immediately, sharing Margaret's discovery, and found Constance's sharp mind already working through the implications. "Charlotte Reeve," Constance said grimly. "I warned you both she would not accept defeat gracefully. This has her fingerprints all over it, however carefully she has tried to disguise them." "How do I prove it?" Elena asked. "Aldrich will not simply take my word against physical evidence he holds in his own hands." Constance considered the problem with the focused intensity of a woman who had navigated society's cruelest games for decades. "We will need more than suspicion, girl. We will need proof Charlotte cannot deny, delivered in a manner that leaves no room for doubt." Together, they devised a plan. Constance, using connections cultivated over a lifetime in society, discovered that the servant who had delivered the forged letter had been paid handsomely for his silence. A servant who, once confronted privately by the formidable Dowager Duchess and offered both amnesty and modest compensation for honesty, proved willing to confirm exactly who had commissioned the forgery and provided the sample of Elena's handwriting used to create it. Armed with this confession, along with the distinctive watermarked paper and a sample of Charlotte's own handwriting obtained from earlier correspondence, Elena requested a meeting with Aldrich, her composure hard-won but steady as she laid the evidence before him. "I understand why you doubted me," she said, though the words cost her considerable effort. "The letter was crafted precisely to exploit old wounds you have carried since your father's betrayals, but I will not simply accept your distance without proving my innocence beyond question." She gestured to the evidence spread across his desk. "This is the paper Charlotte Reeve favors, confirmed by our housekeeper who has seen it before. This is a signed confession from the servant she paid to deliver the letter, and to provide a sample of my handwriting, taken without my knowledge from discarded correspondence. And this," she added, placing a final document before him, "is a sample of Charlotte's own hand, which I trust you will recognize matches the forgery far more closely than my own natural script." Aldrich examined each piece of evidence in silence, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as the full picture assembled before him. When he finally looked up at Elena, his eyes were filled with shame and regret so profound it nearly broke her heart to witness. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I allowed old fears to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I doubted the one person who has never once given me reason for doubt. I do not know how to ask your forgiveness for the pain I have caused you. You need only trust me going forward," Elena said, though tears finally slipped free as the tension of the past days released. "I understand the wounds you carry, Aldrich. I do not fault you for the fear that letter exploited, but I need you to know, beyond any doubt, that my heart has never wavered, and it never will." He crossed the room and gathered her into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of relief and renewed devotion in equal measure. "It will not happen again," he promised. "I swear to you, whatever comes, I will trust you completely, and I will find whoever did this and ensure they answer for the pain they have caused." The confrontation with Charlotte came swiftly. Aldrich, accompanied by Peter Halden as witness, called on her at her London residence, the evidence laid before her with cold, controlled fury that left no room for her usual practiced denials. "You have caused irreparable harm," Aldrich said, his voice hard as stone. "Not only to my marriage, which you nearly succeeded in destroying, but to your own reputation, should any part of this become known more widely. I will not pursue legal action, out of respect for the history we once shared, but I expect you to leave London for the remainder of the season, and I expect never to hear your name spoken in connection with my family again." Charlotte, cornered and finally defeated, offered no further schemes, no clever deflections. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled entirely, revealing beneath it only bitter, hollow disappointment at ambitions that had, in the end, cost her everything she had hoped to gain. Elena and Aldrich returned to Rothmere together, their bond tested by the ordeal but emerging stronger for having weathered it, the trust between them now built on something deeper than the fragile hope it had once been, tempered instead by proof that love, when genuine, could withstand even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. Word of Charlotte's disgrace traveled quickly through London society, though Aldrich had kept the worst details private, unwilling to subject Elena to further gossip even in vindication. Charlotte herself withdrew from society entirely within the month, retreating to a distant relative's estate in the north, her ambitions finally, thoroughly extinguished. The household at Rothmere settled into a period of genuine peace following the ordeal, though Elena noticed a subtle change in Aldrich that spoke to lessons learned rather than wounds merely healed. He became more open with her about the fears that had shaped him, the old grief over his mother's death, the bitter lessons his father's betrayals had taught him about trust and vulnerability. Where once he had guarded these wounds in silence, he now shared them freely, trusting Elena with the fullness of his history, in a way he had never trusted anyone before. "I used to believe," he confessed one evening, as they sat together in the garden his mother had once loved, "that caring deeply for anyone only invited eventual loss or betrayal. My father taught me that lesson through his own failures, and my mother's death seemed to confirm it beyond question. I built walls around myself so thoroughly that I nearly convinced myself I preferred the isolation." "And now?" Elena asked gently. "Now I understand that the walls protected me from nothing worthwhile," he said. "They only kept me from experiencing exactly what I have found with you." I would rather risk the pain of loving deeply than return to the hollow safety of feeling nothing at all. Elena reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of two people who had weathered genuine hardship together and emerged only more devoted for the trial. I am glad you chose to let the walls down, even if it took considerable difficulty to arrive at that choice. The Dowager Duchess, observing the couple's continued devotion in the weeks that followed, allowed herself a rare moment of open sentiment during a family dinner. I confess I did not expect, when this marriage was first arranged out of desperate necessity, that I would live to see my grandson so genuinely happy. You have accomplished what I feared no one ever would, Elena. You have taught him that love need not always end in loss. He taught me a great deal in return, Your Grace, Elena said. I arrived here believing myself entirely alone in the world, save for my father. I did not expect to find a family so willing to embrace me, once given the chance. Peter Halden, visiting again in the following weeks, found himself genuinely moved by the transformation he witnessed in his old friend. I have known you since we were boys, Aldrich, he said one evening over brandy. I never thought I would see you laugh so freely, or speak so openly of your feelings. Whatever difficulty you and Elena weathered together, it seems to have only deepened what already existed between you. She proved herself in ways I could scarcely have imagined, Aldrich said, watching Elena through the study window as she walked the garden below with his grandmother, the two women deep in easy conversation. I doubted her, however briefly, and she met that doubt not with anger, but with patient determination to prove her innocence and preserve what we had built together. I do not deserve such loyalty, but I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it regardless. As autumn gave way to the first frost of winter, the estate that had once felt so cold and joyless to Elena upon her arrival now hummed with quiet warmth, servants moving through their tasks with genuine cheer, the halls no longer echoing with silence but filled instead with conversation, laughter, and the steady, comfortable presence of two people who had built something lasting from the unlikeliest of beginnings. Yet even as peace settled over Rothmere, one final trial remained ahead of them, a challenge that would test not the strength of their bond to outsiders, but their ability to face the future together, hand in hand, whatever it might bring. The fire started in the West Wing storehouse just after midnight, sparked by a lantern left too close to stacked hay during the final preparations for the Winter Harvest Festival. Elena woke first, roused by the sound of shouting in the courtyard and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her window. She was on her feet and pulling on a robe before Aldrich had fully stirred beside her. "Fire," she said urgently, shaking him awake. "I can smell it. Something is burning." They rushed together into the corridor, finding the household already in chaos, servants running with buckets toward the West Wing, where flames had begun climbing the storehouse walls with alarming speed, fed by dry hay and old timber that caught faster than anyone could contain. "The storehouse holds the winter grain," Aldrich said grimly, already moving toward the danger despite Elena's instinctive grip on his arm. "If we lose it, half the tenant families will face a brutal winter without proper stores. We must contain this quickly." Elena did not hesitate to join the effort, organizing the household staff into an efficient line to pass water buckets from the well toward the burning structure, her calm, clear instructions cutting through the panic that threatened to overwhelm the scattered efforts already underway. Aldrich worked alongside his tenants and staff, fighting the flames directly, his coat abandoned, his hands blistering from the heat as he worked to clear a fire break that might prevent the blaze from spreading toward the main house itself. The battle against the fire raged for nearly 2 hours, every able body on the estate joining the effort, until finally, exhausted and soot-stained, they managed to contain the blaze to the storehouse alone, saving perhaps half its precious contents before the flames finally yielded to their combined efforts. In the gray light of early dawn, Elena found Aldrich sitting on an overturned crate near the smoldering ruins, his hands wrapped in hastily applied bandages, his face streaked with ash and exhaustion. She sat beside him without a word, resting her head against his shoulder, both of them too tired for speech, grateful simply for the other's presence after the night's harrowing ordeal. "We lost perhaps half the winter stores," Aldrich said finally, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "It will be a difficult season for the tenant families, even with what remains." "Then we will find a way to help them through it," Elena said simply. "We have faced worse together than a difficult winter, Aldrich. We will manage this too." He turned to look at her, something fierce and grateful in his exhausted expression. "I do not know what I would do, facing any of this, without you beside me. You have become the steadiest thing in my life, Elena. I cannot imagine facing hardship without your strength to lean on." In the days that followed, Elena and Aldrich worked together to address the shortfall. drawing on the estate's reserves, arranging additional grain purchases from neighboring estates, and personally visiting each affected tenant family to ensure no household would go without through the harshest months ahead. Elena's practical resourcefulness proved invaluable, her careful management of limited resources stretching what remained further than anyone had believed possible, while Aldrich's willingness to invest his own personal funds, without hesitation, earned him a depth of loyalty and respect among his tenants that no amount of cold formality could ever have achieved. The Dowager Duchess, watching the couple manage the crisis with practiced efficiency and genuine care for those under their protection, remarked to Peter Halden during his next visit that she had never seen the estate's tenants speak of their Duke and Duchess with such warmth. "They do not see a distant lord and lady anymore," Constance said. "They see two people who genuinely care for their welfare, who worked alongside them through the worst of the fire, who ensured no family went hungry despite the hardship. That kind of loyalty cannot be bought or commanded. It must be earned, and earned it they certainly have." Before winter fully claimed the estate, Aldrich surprised Elena with a gesture she had not expected from a man once so reluctant to show sentiment openly. He arranged a small harvest festival for the tenants, delayed but not abandoned despite the fire, insisting that the community deserved a celebration, even amid hardship, a reminder that resilience and joy could exist side by side. The festival filled the estate's largest barn with warmth and music, tenant families gathering with baskets of preserved food, fiddlers playing lively tunes long into the evening, children chasing each other between the tables while their parents danced and laughed with a freedom Elena had rarely witnessed among people who worked so hard for so little. Aldrich, to the surprise of many, joined the dancing himself, leading Elena through a country reel with unpracticed enthusiasm that drew warm laughter from the gathered tenants. "I did not know you danced," Elena said, breathless and smiling as the reel ended. "I do not, as a rule," Aldrich admitted, equally breathless, "but I find myself willing to attempt many things I once avoided, since you arrived in my life." Near the end of the evening, Aldrich called for quiet, standing before the gathered tenants with Elena's hand in his own. "I wish tonight to thank each of you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the barn, "for your labor through the fire, for your patience through the hardship that followed, and for the loyalty you have shown this family, despite difficult circumstances. My wife and I do not consider ourselves separate from this community. We consider ourselves part of it, and we intend to prove that through our actions in the seasons ahead, not merely through words spoken at a festival." The tenants responded with genuine warmth, raising their cups in a toast that spoke to a bond Elena knew had been earned through hardship rather than granted by title alone. Old Farmer Higgins, whose family had worked Rothmere land for 3 generations, approached them both as the celebration wound down, his weathered face creased with sincere gratitude. "I have served this estate under your father and your grandfather, Your Grace," Higgins said to Aldrich, "and I never once heard either man speak to tenants the way you spoke tonight. Your Duchess has taught this house something it forgot long ago, and I thank the both of you for remembering it now." Elena felt tears gather at the old farmer's words, understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of what she and Aldrich had built together. Not merely a marriage of convenience transformed into genuine love, but a community restored to warmth and trust after years of cold neglect. Walking back to the main house that night, her hand held securely in Aldrich's, she felt a settled certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since the fever village and the fire, together, with patience, honesty, and unwavering commitment to one another. As winter settled fully over the estate, bringing with it the quiet stillness of snow-covered fields and frost-laced windows, Elena discovered she carried a new joy within her, one that filled the household with an anticipation unlike anything Rothmere had known in years. She told Aldrich on a quiet evening by the fire, watching his expression shift from surprise to overwhelming joy as the news settled fully into understanding. "A child," he said, his voice thick with emotion, kneeling before her chair to rest his hand gently against her still flat middle. "Elena, this is more happiness than I ever believed myself capable of holding. Our child will grow up in a house filled with warmth," Elena said softly, "rather than the cold silence you once knew. I intend to see to that personally." "Our child," Aldrich repeated, savoring the words, "will grow up knowing exactly how deeply their parents love each other, and how hard-won that love truly was. I want them to understand that even the coldest beginnings can grow into something beautiful, given patience and honesty, and the willingness to let old walls finally come down." The Dowager Duchess wept openly upon hearing the news, embracing Elena with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I never believed I would live to see this family whole again," Constance said, her usual sharp composure entirely abandoned in her joy. You have given this house more than you know, child. You have given it life again, after so many years of grief and silence. The winter passed more gently than anyone had feared, the estate's careful management ensuring every tenant family weathered the season without true hardship, the storehouse steadily rebuilt in preparation for the following harvest. Elena and Aldrich spent the quiet months together in comfortable domesticity, planning for the child soon to arrive, walking the snow-dusted gardens his mother had once loved, now filled with the promise of new life rather than the shadow of old grief. Spring arrived with the birth of their first child, a daughter with her mother's steady gaze and her father's dark hair, born on a clear morning while the estate's gardens burst into their first blooms of the season. Aldrich held his daughter for the first time, with hands that trembled not from exhaustion or fear, but from an overwhelming tenderness he had once believed himself incapable of feeling. She is perfect, he murmured, gazing down at the small, sleeping face with wonder. Elena, thank you. Thank you for everything you have given this family, everything you have taught me about what love truly means. Elena, exhausted but radiant, reached for his hand. We built this together, Aldrich. Every difficult moment, every trial we faced, brought us here. I would not change a single step of the path that led us to this moment. As the household celebrated the arrival of their new heir, word spread through the estate and beyond of the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere, whose marriage had begun in cold obligation but blossomed, against every expectation, into a partnership built on genuine love, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. The tenants who had once regarded their Duke with wary distance now spoke of him with genuine affection, and the society that had once whispered cruel rumors about the marriage now spoke only of the remarkable devotion that had grown between two people who chose, again and again, to fight for what they had built together. Years later, Elena would often walk the gardens with her growing children, telling them the story of how their parents' marriage began, not as a fairy tale of instant love, but as a slow, hard-won journey from cold obligation to genuine devotion, built through patience, honesty, and the quiet strength that had first caught a cold Duke's attention on a rainy afternoon so many years before. Aldrich, watching his family from the study window his mother had once favored, felt a peace he had never believed himself capable of holding. The cold walls he had built around his heart, long since transformed into something warmer, sturdier, and infinitely more precious than the isolation he had once mistaken for safety. The marriage forced upon him had become the greatest gift of his life, and he never once, in all the years that followed, took for granted the quiet strength that had captured his heart when he least expected it, and healed it in ways he had never believed possible. 3 years passed, and Rothmere Estate had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its old, cold reputation scarcely recognized it. The gardens bloomed year-round now under Elena's careful attention. The halls echoed with the laughter of their daughter, Grace, a spirited child who had inherited her mother's quiet determination, alongside her father's steady gray eyes, and the tenant community thrived under management that valued fairness as much as tradition. It was during the christening preparations for their second child, a son they intended to name after Aldrich's long-departed father, in a gesture of quiet reconciliation with the past, that Baron Edmund Marsh arrived for what would become his final visit to Rothmere. His health had declined steadily over the preceding year, the cough that once seemed minor having settled permanently into his aging lungs, though he insisted on making the journey regardless, unwilling to miss the naming of his second grandchild. "You look tired, father," Elena said, settling him into a comfortable chair near the drawing-room fire, worry evident despite her efforts to hide it. "I am old, my girl, not merely tired," Edmund said, though his smile remained warm despite his obvious frailty. "I have lived to see you happy, settled, surrounded by a family that loves you completely. A father could ask for nothing more, whatever years remain to me now." Grace, not yet 3 years old, climbed into her grandfather's lap with the fearless affection of a beloved child, and Edmund's weathered face softened with a joy that momentarily banished the shadow of illness from his features. Aldrich, watching from the doorway, felt a swell of gratitude for the man whose desperate circumstances had first brought Elena into his life, transforming what began as cold necessity into the deepest happiness he had ever known. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, Baron Marsh," Aldrich said, settling into the chair beside him. "Your daughter saved this family from itself. I do not know who I would have become had she never arrived at Rothmere." "She has always possessed a rare strength," Edmund said, watching Elena move through the room checking on preparations for the christening feast, her movements graceful and assured in a way that spoke to years of confidence earned rather than granted. Even as a girl, Quiet and unassuming, she carried herself with a determination that never wavered, however difficult our circumstances became. I always believed she deserved a life better than the one our family's misfortune seemed destined to offer her. I am grateful beyond words that she found it here, with you. The christening itself took place on a bright spring morning. The small chapel Elena had first discovered dusty and forgotten, now restored to warm, regular use, filled with tenant families and household staff alongside the small circle of close friends and relatives who had witnessed the family's journey from cold beginning to genuine devotion. Peter Halden stood as godfather, his affection for the family evident in the careful attention he paid his small godson throughout the ceremony, while the Dowager Duchess, now considerably softened from the sharp-tongued woman who had first assessed Elena with such wary skepticism, wept openly with joy throughout the proceedings. After the ceremony, as the celebration spread across the estate's grounds under clear spring sunshine, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Aldrich near the chapel entrance, watching their small family and community celebrate together. "Do you remember," Elena asked softly, "the first evening I arrived here, when you told me this marriage existed for nothing more than settling debts?" Aldrich winced slightly at the memory. "I remember it with considerable regret. I was a different man then, Elena, closed off from everything that might have brought me genuine happiness. I am grateful every day that you saw past that coldness, to whatever small potential for change remained beneath it." "I do not regret a single moment of the journey that brought us here," Elena said, leaning into his embrace as they watched their daughter chase butterflies across the chapel lawn while household staff cradled their newborn son nearby. "Every difficulty, every trial we faced together, only deepened what we ultimately built. I would not trade our beginning for an easier path, knowing it led us here." Baron Marsh passed peacefully in his sleep 4 months later, at Rothmere itself, surrounded by his daughter, his son by marriage, and his 2 young grandchildren, having lived long enough to see the family he had once feared he was condemning to a loveless arrangement flourish into something genuinely, deeply happy. Elena grieved his passing with the quiet strength that had defined her throughout every trial she had faced, comforted by Aldrich's steady presence and the knowledge that her father's final years had been filled with the peace and joy he had always hoped for her. The Dowager Duchess in her final years often told anyone willing to listen that the marriage she had once regarded with such wary skepticism had become the greatest source of pride in her long, complicated life. "I have witnessed a great many marriages in my years," she would say, settled comfortably by the fire with her great-grandchildren nearby. "Arrangements built on wealth, on status, on fleeting passion that fades within a season. I have rarely witnessed one built on such patient, hard-won devotion as theirs. Let it be known, whatever difficulties life may bring you, that love built through genuine trial outlasts love that comes easily, every single time." Grace grew into a thoughtful young woman who inherited her mother's quiet strength and her father's steady sense of duty, often walking the estate's gardens with Elena as her own daughter had once walked them with a grieving Aldrich, learning the history of a family transformed not through easy fortune, but through patient devotion weathered against every obstacle placed before it. Her younger brother grew into a boy who idolized his father's steady leadership and his mother's unwavering compassion, carrying forward a legacy of genuine care for the tenant community that had once known only cold indifference from the family that governed their lives. Rothmere Estate, once a house so joyless that servants moved through its halls in careful silence, became known throughout the county as a place of genuine warmth, its tenant community thriving under generations of leadership that valued fairness, honesty, and mutual respect above cold tradition. The story of the cold duke who hated the marriage forced upon him, and the quiet strength that ultimately captured his heart, became something of a local legend, told and retold not as mere romance, but as proof that even the coldest beginnings could grow into something lasting, when both hearts proved willing to do the difficult, patient work required to build genuine love from unlikely circumstances. And in the quiet moments that mattered most, long after the fire had been rebuilt, long after Charlotte's schemes had faded into distant memory, long after the christenings and celebrations and ordinary days had accumulated into a full, rich life together, Aldrich would often find Elena in the garden his mother had once loved, and take her hand exactly as he had on that first quiet evening, when trust between them had only just begun to take root, grateful beyond measure for the marriage he had once resented, and the woman whose quiet strength had transformed his entire world.